Kathryn Morgan, Socrates' comic atopia in the Phaedo and the Gorgias.
Thank you, Don, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation as well. Thanks to all of you for coming, even via Zoom. There's a handout in the chat. I hope you can all get hold of it. So this is a talk about Socratic strangeness and what it means. It's part of a larger project on Plato's relationship with comedy, and it's thus work in progress. So I will be interested to hear any suggestions that you may have. What I want to do is dig down into the notion of a serio-comic Socrates and suggest that Socrates shares with comedy a genius for uncovering and thematizing the incongruous, what is atopon, out of place, and also that he himself embodies this quality. I will therefore also be talking about the place of incongruity, atopia, in the philosophical lifestyle. I want to explore how incongruity works in the Phaedo and then more briefly in the Gorgias. It's no coincidence that these are dialogues where the voice of tragedy is close to the surface. And so this project also has implications for how we conceive Plato's appropriation of tragedy and of comedy. But before we get to the Phaedo and Gorgias, I want to set up Socratic atopia through the Philebus and the Symposium, because this will help us think more generally about the place of comedy and tragedy in human life. I've given you at handout 1 parts of the analysis of mockery and invective that we get in the Philebus. Here we learn that people are ridiculous, geloioi, when they are mistaken about themselves, thinking that they are richer or more beautiful or wiser than they actually are. We laugh, we're told, at self-deceived people out of envy and malice, phonos. This phonos is a pain in the soul. But if we suffer from this emotion, we are also pleased at our neighbor's ills. This is why, when we see a comedy, the disposition of our soul is a mixture of pain and pleasure. Those who cannot retaliate when mocked are ridiculous. Those who are strong enough to retaliate are fearsome and hateful. We should not be pleased at the misfortunes of our friends, but this is what we are doing when we find them ridiculous. So our pleasure there is mixed with pain. And the conclusion, this is handout 1A, is that in lamentations and tragedies and comedies, not only in drama, but in the whole tragedy and comedy of life, pains are mixed with pleasures. And in many other areas too. Socrates, and this is handout 1B, calls this mixture atopon, strange, out of place. Human life then mingles comedy and tragedy, pleasure and pain. Now, another version of this paper addresses in greater detail the problem that this account of comedy that we get in the Philebus doesn't in fact match what we find in the Platonic dialogues, or at least not entirely. That's a problem for another time. Although I'm going to refer to it in passing as I go through this talk. We find the same studied juxtaposition of comedy and tragedy, of course, at the end of the Symposium, where Socrates is said to have argued to Agathon and to Aristophanes that the same person should be able to write both tragedy and comedy. Life, it seems, is a kind of multi-generic enterprise. A knowledgeable analysis of the human experience will recognize that it's characterized both by pleasure and pain. And insofar as the Platonic dialogue is a mirror of human experience, it will contain elements of both comedy and tragedy, the high and the low. The task of the philosopher is, among other things, to sort out what is truly painful or pleasurable, high or low, and to take us to that place, and I use that word advisedly, where we see things and ourselves as they really are. Now, none of us are in that place yet, and even though Socrates comes the closest, he won't inhabit it while he lives in his mortal body. What I want to suggest, though, is that it's Socrates' atopia, his strangeness, his out-of-placeness, that allows him to appreciate the strange and often comic features of our life. In his boisterous praise of Socrates towards the end of the symposium, Alcibiades, and this is handout 2A and 2B, confesses himself hard put to lay out Socrates' atopia, his strangeness. And he subsequently characterizes him as unique among humans, both past and present. He's best compared to Silence and to satyrs. The satyr, as others have pointed out, is a figure who is neither comic nor tragic, a strange hybrid who belongs in neither world, elements of the bestial, elements of the superhuman. Now, the beginning of the dialogue has given us a different picture of Socratic atopia. There, Aristodemus, Socrates' companion to Agathon's symposium, arrives at the house of Agathon only to discover that Socrates is no longer accompanying him. A short search finds Socrates standing in the neighbor's porch, deep in thought, and nothing that anybody can say will make him respond. Agathon comments that this is atopon. It's a very rich word to use because it means both that this is odd and that Socrates is quite literally in the wrong place. He's in the porch next door, he should be in the dining room. Or is it the right place? His physical body is motionless and does not participate in the material world. His mind is elsewhere. Aristodemus explains to Agathon that this is a Socratic habit. And Alcibiades gives us another example later in the dialogue. During the Potidaea campaign, Socrates stood in camp thinking about something for an entire 24-hour period, observed by an audience of Ionians who brought their bedding outside to watch him during the night. And we should note the theatricality here, right? Socrates, all unaware, is performing his thought for an audience who find this amazing and perhaps a little comic. They were in amazement, ethaumaston. So Socratic oddity is amusing. It's the stuff of anecdote. His episodes of stasis, of standing still, feed into the comic type of the absent-minded intellectual. But from a philosophical perspective, he transcends this stereotype because Plato's treatment of him forces us to ask where Socrates' intellect actually is, what it means for a philosopher to be out of place. So, Socrates' strangeness causes amazement and amusement. The tone his friends take in the symposium about this is indulgent, but of course, pursuing his own train of thought is a serious thing for Socrates. It's all a matter of perspective, and this question of perspective is one that's going to recur. Socratic atopia thematizes the incongruous. Whether it's the incongruity of an inconsistent argument or the paradox of an argument that reverses our intuitions about the world. And if I had more time in this paper, I could show you that this is one of the characteristic uses of the adjective atopos in the Platonic corpus. When an argument seems not to be working, it can be, Socrates can say that he has an atopon feeling, or that the results could be atopon. or when he says something that people don't expect him to say, and we're going to come back to this, people say, oh, this is atopon, Socrates. The incongruous is an important aspect of philosophical life because Socratic inquiry turns our world upside down. It changes our perspective upon our life. The philosopher is a person out of place. And I want to spend the rest of this paper investigating Socratic atopia at work in two dialogues that showcase a particular mix of the comic and the tragic, the Phaedo, and then at somewhat less length, the Gorgias. So first of all, the Phaedo. Halliwell, in his book on Greek laughter, spends a rich 5 pages on the Phaedo, and his observations are a good starting point. There are 9 references to laughter and smiling in that dialogue, and nowhere else in Plato does Socrates laugh openly. Laughter in the Phaedo, he concludes, conveys Socratic defiance and transcendence of death. It's also, quote, a dramatic reflection of the strangeness of Socrates, who is able, it seems, to give his friends reason to laugh on the very last occasion when they might have expected it, end quote. This strangeness is, of course, atopia, and takes us to Phaedo's introductory comments on Socrates' last conversation. This is your handout number 3. Phaedo tells us that he did not feel pity for Socrates on that day, since he was sure that all would be well with Socrates after death. Yet he did not feel his usual pleasure in philosophical conversation, but, quote, a simply incongruous atopon feeling came over me, an unaccustomed mixture, compounded from pleasure together with pain. All the interlocutors were both laughing and crying. This passage is a clear and surprising forerunner of the passage in the Philebus we were just looking at. There we saw the importance of childish phonos in comedy, with its incongruous mixture, atopon, of pleasure and pain. Yet the emotions of the interlocutors in the Phaedo cannot easily be assimilated either with tragic or with comic experience. The interlocutors in the Phaedo aren't enjoying giving in to weeping, which is what's described for tragedy in the Philebus, nor is their laughter caused by ridicule or contempt, which is the case for comedy. The experience in the Phaedo is, in fact, a kind of philosophical inversion of the experience of tragedy and comedy critiqued in the Philebus. Yet both experiences are described as atopon. The paradoxical nature of bodily pleasure and pain will be highlighted again in the same terms when the disciples enter the prison. And Phaedo says, a simply incongruous atopon feeling came over me, an unaccustomed mixture compounded from pleasure together with pain. The paradoxical nature of bodily pleasure and pain is highlighted again in the same terms when Socrates, just released from his chains, because it's his last day, remarks how atopon pleasure is, or rather how atopon what humans call pleasure is, and how inextricably linked to pain, as if these two things had one head. He remarks that if Aesop had thought of this, he would have made a fable out of it. Aesop isn't, of course, a comedian, but this allusion to a humble paraliterary form contributes to the deflation of an overwrought and quasi-tragic situation. Socrates' release from his chains is, of course, highly symbolic. He's been held in place, but is now free to go. From the Athenian perspective, the chains were there to stop him escaping, But we know that Socrates has been held in place by his convictions at another place. I think it's in the Gorgias. We hear talk about the adamantine chains of argument. Later on in the Phaedo, when Socrates gives his intellectual biography, he remarks that the cause of everything he does is his mind. The cause of the current conversation that they're having in the prison is not physical accidents such as sound and air, but, and this is handout number 4, because he thinks it's right to stay in prison. Since, by the dog, I think that these bones and sinews would long ago have been in Megara or Boeotia, transported by my opinion about what is best, if I did not think it juster and better to submit to whatever penalty the city imposes, rather than fleeing and running away. To call things like this causes is just too atopon, just too incongruous. So first of all, this is a joke. Yet it's a joke which thematizes a philosophical point. What should count as a cause? What is the place of the philosopher and of Socrates in particular? There's a sophisticated underlying multi-level pun going on here. Socrates' physical presence in prison is the occasion for Aesopic gags and counterfactuals sworn by the dog. But the real joke is the incongruity between Socrates' perspective and that of everyone else. No one else thinks that he should be there. All his friends wanted him to escape. Any Athenian on the street that you asked would have said, well, of course he'll escape if he can. So from the larger perspective of the Phaedo, Socrates is, comically, from the normal point of view, atopos, because he's been devoting his entire mental energy to abstracting his reason from his body, to severing the link that ties him to this physical place, yet not in the way that people would normally expect. The true philosopher is fundamentally atopos in a way that's an endless source of amusement and comedy to others. We see this played out in the digression on the philosophical life in the Theaetetus, which I don't have time to talk about today. But this atopia causes wry amusement even to Socrates himself. This dynamic is played out in a comic routine earlier in the dialogue. At 61b, Socrates, in answer to a question relayed from Euenus, explains why he is putting Aesop in verse and composing proems to Apollo at the end of his life. Socrates asks Cebes to pass on his explanation. I'm not going to go into that. He asks him to pass on this explanation to Euenus and to tell him farewell, but also to tell him, if he's sensible, that he, Euenus, should follow Socrates as quickly as possible. This is handout number 5. Right. What a thing to say, replies Cebes, who knows Euenus well and doesn't think that he is at all the sort of man who's going to want to follow Socrates' advice. This is another joke, but again, one with a philosophical point. Socrates will go on to explain that death is the desire of the philosopher, but that one must not go so far as to commit suicide. The comedy continues as Socrates explains this prohibition. Perhaps Cebes will find it amazing that in this sole instance, it's not the case that it would be better for some people to be dead, that is, in the case of suicide. Amazing too, that those for whom death would be an advantage can't procure it for themselves, but have to wait for a benefactor. And that triggers the smile. And Cebes laughs gently, and he agrees in his own Boeotian dialect. That's 62a, I don't have it on the handout. Socrates adds that this prohibition is because we are the gods' possessions and mustn't do anything without permission. Cebes counters that in this case, Socrates should want to stay around in the company of his good masters and not skip town. A philosophical willingness to die is, he says, incongruous. It's like something atopon. Socrates enjoys this response, his thenai edoxe. He felt pleasure in it. Does he smile? We're not told so. The conversation continues. But it reaches its climax, and this is handout 6, as Socrates concludes that true philosophers are always preparing themselves for death. It would thus be incongruous, atopon, comic even, to be troubled at the thought of it. Simmias now laughs in response, even though he says he doesn't feel like laughing. And then he carries on the joke. Most people, he says, especially his fellow Boeotians, would say that philosophers are half dead anyway. And they think that they, that is the philosophers, deserve it. They deserve to die. Socrates retorts that this is true, but not in the way people think. Simmias had focalized his response through the polloi. It hasn't escaped them that philosophers deserve to die. Socrates, though, thinks that it has escaped them in what sense the philosophers deserve to die and what death awaits them. Finally, he closes the shtick, dismissing the many and restricting the discussion to themselves. It's worth underlining how extensive this comic routine is, starting with the advice to Euvenus and ending with the dismissal of the opinions of the many. Cebes dropping into his own Boeotian dialect, which doesn't happen a lot in Plato, in fact, very rarely, right? And Simmias's passing reference to the anti-intellectual proclivities of the Boeotians are modes of presentation that would not be out of place in Aristophanes. Indeed, there's a pervasive feeling, I think, of old comedy as the philosophers deserve to die joke is worked and reworked from a number of different perspectives. The opinions of the many here anticipate the so-called ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy in Republic Book 10, where miscellaneous quotes from comedy mock philosophical pretensions. Although in the Phaedo, it's not a case of allusion to comedy, so much as to the proto-comic general prejudice that underlies comedy's more developed routines. The entire sequence, as well as the philosophical discussion, could be considered an exploration of Socratic and philosophic atopia, where atopia is a key concept both for argumentative incongruity and for potentially comic disjunction. As the dialogue draws to its close and Socrates tells his eschatological myth, the question of the place of the philosopher returns. After death, we're told in the myth, souls are collected somewhere and they are judged. And every soul then inhabits the place that is appropriate for it. This is in 108, topon proseconta. Now, Socrates then goes on to describe the world after death. He says there are many amazing places in the earth, and the description of these topoi take up a lot of the myth. I'm not going to linger here on the fantastic geography of the true earth in the eschatology, but what I do want to do is bring out its utopian and comic echoes. As Socrates starts his account of the afterlife, he emphasizes that the path to Hades is not simple, as Aeschylus makes out, in a play that we don't have, unfortunately, but it's confusing and complicated. This is an inference that Socrates makes from contemporary rituals, he says. But he could also, although he doesn't mention this, have been thinking about the beginning of Frogs the Frogs of Aristophanes, as Heracles and Dionysus discuss the best route to the lower world, right? Is it by suicide, perhaps by throwing yourself off a tall tower? What is the way? What is the physical path to Hades? Socrates declares that the real earth is very much bigger than we think. We think that we're living on its surface, but we're really living in a misty hollow. At 109b, and this is handout 7a, he compares the perspective of those who live around the Mediterranean to ants or frogs around a pond. We are too weak, he says, and this is now handout 7b, to make our way out of this hollow. But if we had wings, we could poke our heads out and look up at what lies above, like fish in our world who pop their heads up out of the sea. The verb here is anakupto, and it has a good comic pedigree. Now, Plato, the comic poet, wrote a comedy called Ants, as did Cantharus, while Socrates wrote an Ant-Men. In Aristophanes' Frogs, Dionysus crosses into Hades via a lake and is serenaded by the famous frog chorus. Magnes and Callias also wrote plays by this name. Archippus wrote a Fishes. The idea that a man could get wings and fly up into the air and then look around is familiar to us from Aristophanes' Birds. Socrates' comparison of the situation of ordinary humans to frogs and ants, his aspiration for wings, these all resonate with the world of comedy and its animal choruses. Yet, as we would expect, there's a difference. The animal perspective here, if we accept birds and their wings, expresses intellectual inferiority and an implied hierarchy of being. As we are to the animals, so the inhabitants of the higher realms would be to us. Indeed, an early consideration of metempsychosis early in the dialogue, halfway through the dialogue, envisions that after death, insufficiently purified souls will migrate into the bodies of donkeys, wolves, hawks, and kites, or, if they're social and disciplined souls, into bees, wasps, and ants. The utopian vision of a world where Socrates hopes to have a better habitation is a philosophical transformation of the desires of heroes such as Paesthetirus, he who persuades his companions, and Euripides, hopeful, in the Birds. Socrates says several times during the Phaedo that he is making his journey to the other world full of hope, elpis. Like a comic hero, Socrates constructs an alternate reality where his wishes will come true. Yet Socrates' wish fulfillment, or so he hopes, is based not upon fantasy, but on the rigor of philosophical argument, the arguments for immortality that take up the bulk of the dialogue. The utopian fantasies of old comedy often focused on the unlimited satisfaction of bodily desires, a place or time when blood sausages leap spontaneously into the mouth and rivers flow with soup. Some of the comedies that showcased a life of blissful abundance set this life in the underworld, such as the Metales of Socrates. Socrates' vision is, of course, a much more austere one where bodily contamination is despised and sidelined. Yet the Phaedo and Old Comedy share a disposition to envision a utopian environment achieved through the efforts of an unlikely hero. Both comedy and the Platonic dialogue question and undermine the presuppositions on which our everyday life is based and stake a claim to authority for their alternative vision. Both achieve their effects through a change in perspective. This is particularly clear in the Phaedo, where we zoom out to look down on the earth as a multicolored patchwork ball. That's the macro level. But the dynamic is repeated in small-scale jokes and teasing throughout the dialogue and is embodied in Socratic atopia. It's only by changing perspective that we can see that Socrates' death is not the tragedy that some might think. Both comedy and the Platonic dialogue also have a combative and appropriative relationship with tragedy. Both contain it within their larger framing. After Socrates has finished his myth of the afterlife, he quips, and this is handout number 8, that as a tragikos man might say, my day of fate summons me, and it's almost time for me to have my bath. This sentence, as Christopher Rowe comments, has a tragicomic tone. Imminent death might seem like a disaster to some, but not to Socrates. And he undermines the tragic moment by stressing that he's bathing for the convenience of the women of his household. A few sentences later, and this is handout number 9, he responds to Crito's question about how they should bury him by telling him to bury him however he likes, if he can catch him, and then explains with a laugh that Crito is not persuaded, right? So this is one companion that Socrates has not persuaded. He's not persuaded that it's the real Socrates, that the real Socrates is the one who's talking and not the corpse that he will soon see. The idea that the intellectual's mind is somehow separable from his body finds comic expression in Aristophanes' Acharnians, and this is handout number 10. When Dicaeopolis visits Euripides to borrow the rags of Telephus for reasons that we don't need to go into. When Dicaeopolis knocks on the front door and asks the slave whether Euripides is inside, the slave answers, he's inside and he isn't, if you know what I mean. And he explains, his mind is outside collecting verselets and not inside, but he himself is inside composing a tragedy upstairs. It's interesting that in this passage, a notion of tragic composition as a kind of ecstasy, being outside oneself, is assimilated to quasi-philosophical mind journeying. Both the exchange between Socrates and Crito and the one between Euripides' slave and Dicaeopolis create comedy out of the disjunction between a mind or psyche and the physical self. In the Acharnians, tragic pretensions are deflated as Dicaeopolis barges in and gets what he wants out of Euripides, collapsing the disjunction. In the Phaedo, Socrates has the last laugh. When Crito tries to bury him, he won't be there. When Dicaeopolis turns himself into a tragic hero to diffuse the hostilities between himself and the chorus of Acharnians, he does so on his own terms. Socrates alludes to, but refuses the transformation. And this is a comic move of a slightly different type. So it is, and this is handout 11, in Aristophanes' piece, that Trygaius' daughter thinks that Trygaius should have flown to heaven on Pegasus so that he could appear more like a tragic character to the gods, tragikoteros, though her suggestion is resolutely resisted by her father. I'll return in a moment to the containment of the tragic and direct the last part of this paper to the Gorgias. But first I want to give a footnote to Socrates' comic atopia in the Phaedo, because the notion that the mind could be in one place and the body in another, and the Socratic connections of this association were of course thematized in the Symposium, as we saw earlier. The disjunction between mind and body that was adumbrated there is now brought into physical reality by Socrates' execution and emphasized by the argumentation of the dialogue. Let's move on to the Gorgias, which, in common with other Platonic dialogues, uses the comic juxtaposition of the low and high as a philosophical tool. and by so doing, dramatizes the clash of perspectives that occurs when a philosopher interacts with an interlocutor who has non-philosophical priorities. Like the Phaedo, it presents us with philosophical transformations of comic motifs and addresses questions of perspective and atopia in terms of the containment of tragedy. Gorgias and Phaedo share a serio-comic approach to the conversation, though this approach is differently inflected in each. While the Phaedo's laughter is gentle and cooperative, the Gorgias's humor has more mockery in it. We're closer here, I think, to the comedy of the Philebus. Yet the Gorgias too, as has been widely recognized, looks towards Socrates' trial and execution. Both dialogues have a notable clustering of atopia vocabulary. While the tragedy in the Phaedo is situational, the Gorgias explicitly models the confrontation of Socrates and Callicles on a Euripidean tragedy. Overall, though, it's striking that these two dialogues might be seen as tragic in normal terms, but are also the ones where a comic dynamic is in evidence, reinforcing, I think, the point that a Platonic dialogue can aspire to surpass dramatic genres like comedy and tragedy, and do so by a technique that is comic, the appropriation of tragedy. The interaction between Socrates and his interlocutors in the Gorgias is aggressive and full of invective possibilities. Socrates' propensity to use low examples like cobblers and fullers and cooks and doctors makes him seem to his opponents to be shameless and a crude, low speaker, a vulgar prattler and mischief maker, as Nancy Warman has pointed out, an irreverent comic rogue to match the Aristophanic hero. Callicles' violent intervention into the discussion occurs through a question about whether Socrates is serious or joking about what he's saying. Is Socrates serious? When Socrates starts to analyze rhetoric, this is handout 12, he fears to give his opinion because it might be rather boorish, agrikoteron, or we might say rustic, like the Aristophanic countryman. It might be boorish of him to give his opinion in case Gorgias thinks that he is making a comedy, diakomodane, of Gorgias's activity. The dialogue thematizes play and joking and seriousness in a manner that's too pervasive to be laid out in detail here. But what I want to linger on instead is the way that Plato has his Socrates and Callicles subsume the tragic perspective into invective interaction, although as always, there's more at stake for Socrates than mere mockery. Our first example is the well-known allusions to Euripides' Antiope made by Callicles in his tirade against Socrates. Callicles starts his attack, and this is handout 13, by asking Socrates whether he's serious. If so, human life would be turned upside down, and we would be doing entirely the opposite of what we should. Callicles begins then by conjuring a world of comic inversion and play. This is Socrates' world. He can't possibly be serious. He continues by presenting his own view of natural justice, that is, those who are naturally superior deserve more. And he urges Socrates to abandon the childish pursuit of philosophy by appealing to Euripides. In Euripides' Antiope, the two brothers, Amphion and Zethus, debated the advantages of the contemplative and quiet life versus the life of political action. In the play, Zethus, the active politician, wins the argument, though at the end, we learn that the walls of Thebes will in fact be built through the power of Amphion's lyre. Callicles, and this is handout 14, says he feels towards Socrates as Zethus does to Amphion, and he quotes several lines of the play in which Amphion is urged to abandon subtleties that can make no contribution to political life. Isn't Socrates ashamed that he would be helpless to defend himself if he were dragged into court on a trumped-up charge? This series of allusions has been well studied. Andrea Nightingale shows how Callicles and Socrates map onto Zethus and Amphion, but also how the dialogue turns the table on Callicles. By the time we finish the myth of the afterlife at the end of the dialogue, we see that it will be Callicles who will reel and gape and be helpless before the judges of the dead. It's Callicles who is ridiculous. Plato, as Andrea Nightingale observes, criticizes his model even as he imitates its themes and structure. The seriousness of the tragic hero is ridiculed in order that a new kind of hero can enter the stage. This is, she says, a case of parody. What I want to underline is that this kind of parodic appropriation is comic. Not that Gorgias is a comedy, but that the game of ridicule that Callicles is playing, together with its tragic appropriations, is comic, at least in part. Socrates' response is to undermine Callicles' notion of who is better and deserving of more, and discussion turns to control of the appetites. Callicles wants to maximize them, but, and this is handout 15a, Socrates implies that it's those who are in need of nothing who are happy. In that case, Callicles retorts, a stone or a corpse would be happy. And this is where Socrates engages in his own appropriation of tragedy. Life, as Callicles describes it, is terrible, denos. But Socrates quotes Euripides. Who knows if living is death, and to be dead, living? He goes on to quote a mystic doctrine that the body is our tomb, and then gives an allegorical interpretation of the myth of the water carriers in the underworld to prove the inferiority of a life of insatiable appetite. The details needn't concern us here. But, handout 15, as he concludes, he comments that these things are pretty strange or incongruous. They are atopia, but they show what I want to prove to you, that is the inferiority of the life of appetite. Now, Callicles is, of course, unconvinced. The life of restraint is the life of a stone. And it's at this point that Socrates proceeds to make him admit that the life of scratching, and in the end, the life of a kinidos would be happy. A procedure, this is handout 16, that makes Callicles call him atopos and a cheap orator. What's Socrates doing when he makes his way into an allegory of psychic continence by quoting Euripides? First of all, he's matching Callicles' Euripidean citation. Just as Callicles' Euripidean quotations were used in service of the larger invective goal of telling Socrates that he's an idiot, in the disingenuous guise of friendship, so Socrates uses his Euripides to continue to underline the inversion that's been a subtext in his argument all along. The implications of his speech are that Callicles wants to live the life of a greedy bird, a greedy plover, of someone who is always scratching himself, the life of a kinidos, someone fixated on being sexually penetrated. And it's not far from here to the katapougon, sexually subservient politicians of Aristophanes. The comparisons are comic and they are insulting. The life that Callicles wants is the dream of every comic hero, maximal satisfaction of the appetites and of power. But Socrates knows that what Callicles is really aiming for is the life of the rejected comic other, the katapougon. Socrates' citation of Euripides does something else too. It returns us to the vertiginous perspectives of the Phaedo. We remember that the banter in that dialogue played upon popular quasi-comic perceptions that philosophers were half dead. It seems clear that Callicles would share this view. Remember that he thinks that a continent person might as well be a corpse. The possibility that what we might consider life is really a kind of death, however, together with its Orphic or Pythagorean resonances, chimes perfectly with the Phaedo's insistence that the best existence is one in which we are separated from our bodies. What seems to be a tragic perspective might in fact be a comic one, with a subtext of comic utopianism. It all depends on your point of view. And this in turn brings us back to atopia. Accusations of atopia are frequently bandied about in the Gorgias. Polus and Callicles think Socrates is atopos. Socrates thinks that it's the sophists and the politicians who are really atopoi. Each is out of place in the other's cosmos, and this makes them ridiculous to each other. But it also has metaphysical implications. In what place will they end up? The Isles of the Blessed or Tartarus? There's a sense in which every human soul is atopos, because it's not in a place where it can most truly be itself. And this makes life at some level a humorous endeavor. Socrates' attempts to live in the realm of rationality and logical coherence make him look absurd to others and out of place, yet it is they who are ridiculous and atopoi. As the stranger will say in the Laws, human life is not worthy of very much seriousness. What of tragedy and comedy then? And this is where I'm going to end. Platonic allusions to comedy and tragedy take words and motifs out of their original context and appropriate them for the purposes of philosophy. These appropriations of comic and tragic motifs are atopo, literature out of place. They're sometimes humorous, they're sometimes incongruous, and the resulting patchwork is a token of the complexity of human experience. It may also reflect the misguided nature of human literary production, which takes seriously and mocks the wrong kinds of things. Yet when we pause to consider the appropriateness of a tragic or comic line or motif, we engage in a literary kind of philosophy. What tone really does fit this or that kind of encounter? How does philosophy transform our priorities or presuppositions? The link between comedy and the Platonic dialogue is strong, and it's constructed through Socrates. Like comedy, Plato's dialogues meditate upon and question generic protocols. Just as the perception of and capitalizing on incongruity is the task of comedy, so it's the task of Socrates and of philosophy. Yet because of Plato's totalizing ambitions, his dialogues put not only tragedy, but also comedy in their place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kathryn. I will, as usual, I'll clap on behalf of all the muted participants. As those of you who've been to these before know, we now have a discussion period moderated by me. If you wish to make a comment or ask a question, please click the raise your hand button, which you can find under reactions at the bottom of the screen. If you have trouble with that, send a chat, or you can send an email to me at socratessociety@rice.edu. I'll be monitoring the email just in case. Please keep your questions concise. So I invite questions or comments. Let's see. Olga, I'm not sure if I get, let me apologize once for mispronouncing people's names. But let's see, Pierre d'Estrée.
Oh, hi, Don. Hi, Kathryn. Very nice to see you. Hi. So actually, well, thank you so much for this magnificent talk. I really liked the idea that atopia can match with what we call incongruity. I mean, since incongruity is really central in every theory of humor, at least nowadays, I think it really helps us to understand what's going on in Plato uses of humor. So thank you so much for this magnificent idea. I think it's really crucial here. But now I don't have any specific question, but just perhaps a kind of suggestion. It's about the tragikos aner in the Phaedo at 115a, right? I think you mentioned that passage because, sorry, I don't have your handout, but no, it's all right. But I suppose you mentioned that at one point, right? Saying that Socrates says, I'm the tragikos man, or actually I look like as if I were a tragikos man, right? That's 115a.
Yeah.
But then I think the joke here is because of what follows this sentence. So the sentence is, so it is my fate, to be called now. And then what he says just next is really funny. I mean, but now the time is, so timoi ora, prostolutron, to go into the bathroom and have a bath, right? I mean, that's really funny.
Yes, it's bathos.
Sorry, bathos, what do you mean?
Sorry, that was actually a little bit too extreme.
Yeah, no, all right.
No, absolutely. So yeah, so I think what's going on there is, right, the puncturing of that tragic moment, right? Yeah. My fate is calling me. I better back off. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's almost Python-esque. I absolutely agree.
Yeah. It's a good joke. Okay, thank you so much.
Thomas Sabon.
Thanks for the talk, Kathryn. It was really interesting and a lot of rich material there. I wanted to ask about the idea of a change in especially physical perspective as having comic resonances or being connected to comedy in general. So I immediately found myself thinking of two philosophical instances that are outside of the Platonic context, one from before, one from after. The first is Parmenides' poem, right? So wherever the gates of night and day are supposed to be, whether it's above the earth or below, surely that's going to involve some sort of change of place or change of perspective. And then I also found myself thinking about Marcus Aurelius on the view from above. So I'm thinking of places like Meditation 748 that I just stuck in the chat, right? So the one who talks about human affairs should look upon all the things on the earth as though looking down from far above on herds and military affairs, fields, marriages, divorces, and so on. By the time we get to Aurelius, that seems to be a deadly serious exercise, not a comic exercise, I would have thought. And the Parmenidean poem, which also seems to involve this atopos, change of place that you were describing, again seems to be a very serious exercise. So should I be thinking that there are supposed to be comic resonances in either or both of these passages? Or is it not the mere change of perspective within a philosophical context that makes it a comic illusion?
No, that's a great question. And I think that it's not every time that we get a change of perspective is it going to be a comic change of perspective. What I find interesting in the Gorgias and Phaedo and in various other places in the Platonic corpus is how it's connected with right, mockery or amusement or laughter or comedy, right? So for example, in parts of the I think it's that maybe the Charmides or maybe it's the Theaetetus, where we sort of talk about atopos, right, comic philosophical conclusions, and Socrates says, well, maybe I'm babbling, like lay rein, a very, very comic word. But you're absolutely true that the notion of a philosophical change of perspective is, is much broader, right? in Parmenides' poem, when we go beyond the gates of the paths of the night and day, it's not just that we are, well, we're doing it, we're changing our perspective, both like physically and metaphysically. It's not, it's presented as a real chariot ride where we are traveling over the earth and going to wherever we're going, and the gates of the paths of night and day. So we might say, oh, he's up in the air, or whether he's going up or whether he's going down. But of course, we might say that, and I won't say this is necessarily humorous, but what we find out when we get the revelation from the goddess is that everything that we think is real is in fact not real, right? That we have, well, I know that there are different ways of interpreting the poem, but in fact, we've got it wrong, right? The entire mental apparatus with which we approach our life is mistaken. And that, for Parmenides, is a serious thing indeed. So yeah, I think you're right. It's not always comic. I think one of the things that has come between Parmenides and Plato is Attical comedy. And I think that changes things, right? It changes things partly because of the way that Socrates was satirized in old comedy, but also because, as I've argued elsewhere, comedy offers a kind of model for appropriating other genres. And I think that's what the Platonic dialogue is doing. But yeah, great. I'm sorry, did I answer your question?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Just two really, really quick follow-ups. One, I'm not sure that old comedy has as transformative of a role, particularly in the use of atopos. So I'm thinking of Xenophanes. His siloi are reported to us at various points as being atopoi siloi. Proclus, I think, among others, calls them that. So I'm thinking that to be a atopos, and for that to have some sort of like comic resonance, that's already going to be present around the period of time that we think Parmenides is writing. So I don't think that we can like
now that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I did not know, or if I did, I have forgotten that the siloi are called atopoi. That would be worth following.
I'll send you the reference in an email if you want. But then the other worry is going to be, I had thought that atopia was being directly connected to comedy in your talk, that the two were supposed to walk hand in hand. But now in response to me vis-a-vis Parmenides, it's sounding like one subset of atopia is going to be comic, and the subset that's going to be comic is going to be the subset that is going to be funny for a different reason, maybe, or something. The conclusion is funny. So the worry now is going to be, I think, that it's not atopia per se that's the comic element. It's the consequences of finding yourself in an atopos place that's going to be comic. It may seem subtle, but I do think that's an important distinction.
Yes, I will have to think more about that. And I think that yes, that's probably right. But I need to process it. Thank you.
All right, Olga Gurin.
Thank you, and thank you, Kathryn. I really love the paper. I wanted to bring your attention to Phaedo 117D just for a moment and ask, my question is pretty general, just ask for your thoughts on this. This is where, in my translation, it says, but Apollodorus, who hadn't stopped weeping even during the whole time before, at that moment, this is when Socrates drinks the hemlock, really let loose with such a storm of wailing and fussing that there wasn't a single one of those present whom he didn't break up, except, of course, Socrates himself. The reason I bring this up is this is at the very end of the dialogue, as you can see, and this is one of those details that I love so much finding in Plato, where kind of hidden in the dialogue, there's something that completely changes how you reread it. And it is a soundtrack that you reread with once you've gotten to this point, and you can't not after that. So it affects every subsequent rereading of the dialogue quite a bit, I think. and I think this is crucial, and I just was wondering, in light of your talk, the tragic comment elements and in the dialogues, just if you could comment on that and what you think the significance of that might be for you.
Sure. Well, so the interesting thing is that they have all throughout the dialogue, they have the interlocutors have tried to bear up for Socrates' sake, right? You know, they don't want to distress him. This is one of the reasons that they're sort of so scared, that Simmias and Cebes are so scared of pressing their objections, because they don't want to upset him, right, by demolishing his argument for immortality as he is just about to drink the hemlock. He shows that this is, you know, this is of no concern to him. He really, he really doesn't mind. He really wants to pursue the argument. But I think what's important about the passage that you mentioned is what happens directly afterwards, right? Apollodorus is absolutely inconsolable. Everyone cries, and Socrates, and Socrates rebukes them. He says, "This is why I sent away the women, so that we wouldn't have, right, this kind of nonsense." So I think it's right that tragedy almost breaks through, and Socrates says, "No, I refuse this."
I think, if I may, my point is not so much that he cries at that point and can't control it at this point. My point is the phrase that he had been weeping the entire time. So the thing I mentioned about the soundtrack, that is the sound that is present the entire time of this conversation. And we don't know about it until the very end of the dialogue. So this was my point about rereading with that sound in the back.
Sorry, I didn't see what you meant.
Sorry, I may not have been clear. So I guess that's the emphasis that I would bring out, is how do you then reread the dialogue with, like, knowing that he's weeping in the background the whole time? This is, in some sense, you could say somehow similar maybe to the hiccups in the symposium. You know this is going on, even though it's not a detail that you are, in the narrative, maybe required to just, it's not a detail that is brought out so much that you are focusing on it, unless you are paying attention enough to know that it's there. And it's similar to this, except obviously this is very devastating, that you hear the sound of his weeping the entire time, and just the kind of significance that bears on the entire dialogue.
Right. I would say, does it make the dialogue tragic? I'm not sure it does. I think it's an interesting counterpoint. It's as though then, right, if weeping is the soundtrack that's going on in the background, it's a constant reminder of the non-philosophical approach to the situation, maybe something that's there to remind us that this is really what we must resist. Because if he's weeping all the time, right, he can't be engaging in the dialogue, right? He can't actually be taking in the arguments, right? So it's almost as though he is, he's one of the polloi, and we know from the symposium, don't we, that he's just almost a kind of like Socrates freak, right? That this is somebody who engages, as Ruby Blondal would say, not in structural imitation of Socrates, but he's a kind of slavish Socratic. So I would say that if that's the soundtrack, and that's a really interesting point, it is something that there as a counterpoint to be resisted, that we are meant to think like, no, not the world of tragedy.
The only quick thing I will add, if that's okay, just super fast, is that in the symposium, he's the one that narrates the symposium. And I would only say that the only way we know that he is the follower of Socrates to the extent that you are mentioning is from him, which I think makes that even more interesting, right? Because he is the only voice in the symposium. And so I just wanted to add that.
Well, so I mean, and again, this could take us back to Ruby's interesting book on the mask of character. What does it mean to be a Socrates groupie? Precisely what kind of imitation are we meant to engage in when we engage in mimesis of Socrates? And that is something that's an ongoing question with his disciple interlocutors, I think, all the way through the corpus.
All right, Eric Brook.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Excellent talk. My question has to do more with maybe philosophical import and has to do with atopia in terms of absurdity.
Mm-hmm.
So you've talked about it as incongruity. It gets translated, at least in Phaedo 64, as per absurdum. And I'm wondering to what extent the notion of the absurd, particularly with the philosophical identity of Socrates or of the philosopher in general, to what extent the incongruity of it has an absurd, there wasn't much said about absurdity or irony.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a later, I'm thinking like Kierkegaard, this is a later way in which Socrates is conceived of as an absurd, ironic. And this is built into his philosophical identity, at least the way he's interpreted by later people. I'm wondering to what extent that is being precluded, or is that built into your notions when you were talking about incongruity of his identity and the way he's acting, particularly in terms of irony. He's there, but he's not there. You know, so there's a sense of, it seems like he's there, but he's not there.
Yep.
So whatever import you can think of in those terms.
So I mean, I don't think that my reading precludes consideration of absurdity at all, because the absurd we could also say is a matter of perspective. It's a matter of perceiving something that doesn't fit. I think that, and that irony too is part of this whole picture. We think that Socrates means one thing. We're never quite sure what it is that he actually means, although we can sometimes make a good guess. What he thinks, the conclusions he makes, will sometimes seem absurd to other people, but I think that that's just a different way of thinking about the incongruous. It's out of place. So I think that we could meld the two together.
So you would affirm that he actually is absurd?
From whose point of view?
I guess I'm thinking about it maybe existentially.
The
fact of it, maybe like Kierkegaard saying, is an actual absurd figure.
It depends whether we think that absurdity, or I suppose Socrates would say absurd, yes, but not in the way that people think, right? You could actually imagine this whole riff on sort of what people call absurdity. Yes, of course, they think I'm absurd. I'm not absurd in the way that they actually think. So depending on how flexible we want to be with philosophic absurdity, I think I could go there.
Okay, good. That's helpful. Thank you very much.
Okay, Matteo.
Kathryn, thank you so much for your talk. It was quite suggestive, and I feel like I still need to process it. But a question that I had was this idea of a comic atopos in terms of thinking of Socrates this way, or his philosophy this way. I feel like some of his interlocutors become atopos, and this might be an effect that he has on them. Let me give you some examples. I think that Euthyphro feels like he is justified in what he is doing. But as he sort of converses with Socrates, he realizes that actually maybe his very position is out of place. Some other examples are Crito in the Phaedo himself, I feel, is atopos. Here they're having this amazing discussion on the soul, and Crito consistently is not getting that Socrates is actually more than his body. So this, I mean, this isn't meant to be critical, it may be even an amplification, a suggestion that some of what is going on in the Platonic dialogues is not only that we can conceive of Socrates and his philosophy as atopos, but that he can create these effects on his interlocutors as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's one of the, it's like, you know, the injection of Socrates into the world causes people to feel that they are in the wrong place, that the world has been turned upside down in ways that they never expected. And so certainly, like, yeah, Euthyphro is made to appear strange. I've actually got the Euthyphro uses of atopos in a document somewhere, but I've not worked them up yet. Because of course one realizes when you start to work out, oh my gosh, like this could be a book. And say, no, it can't be a book. But certainly in the Gorgias, right, Socrates calls Callicles and Polus atopos. They think that he's atopos. So yeah, I think absolutely the interlocutors are certainly, from Socrates' point of view, from the philosophical point of view, they're strange, they're in the wrong place. Euthyphro's in the wrong place, right? Because he shouldn't be at the court, right? He shouldn't be prosecuting his father. And what happens at the end is he leaves, he goes to a different place. I mean, one could sort of riff on this for a while, but yeah, I'm on board with that.
All right, Dan Graham.
I thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. I'm thinking, just want to broaden the discussion a little bit here, the context, because I think this supports your position that we can worry about people, for instance, weeping in the Phaedo and acting tragic. But I think the thing to remember is that this genre is defined by what Socrates does. He's the would-be tragic hero, and here is a drama in which Socrates has all the ingredients of a good tragedy, and Socrates refuses to play the tragic hero. It's a kind of anti-tragedy, and I think it's to me, very explicitly so, that there's a lot of some of the stuff you were talking about, the strange combination of pleasure and pain and so forth, but a reminder that the outcome isn't at all what anybody expects. It's a kind of triumph at the end instead of a terrible disaster that takes place here, and the kind of apotheosis of Socrates. And again, let's think about what Plato has Socrates saying in the Republic about drama and so forth. Tragedy, there's something wrong with tragedy. It makes people, it sort of celebrates people losing control of their emotions and so forth. We need a new kind of genres of fiction in which people don't misbehave under pressure and so forth. And so I think, and again, Plato is redefining certain kinds of dramatic situations here. Comedy is a good place, of course, to rethink things and play around with them and so on. But there is, Thomas mentioned about, and Marcus Aurelius, and this is very serious business. But I think for Plato too, this is very serious business. You can laugh about it, but there's a very deep seriousness behind the joking here, that the point is that if you're really a philosopher, there is no tragedy for you. And if you're a rational person, you can transcend the tragic situations and make them into triumphs and so forth. That's a kind of cultural revolution that's going on. And I think you do see it, and certainly seems to be followed up by some of the Stoics and others who kind of start writing in different genres that are breaking out of the old genres of the time.
Yes, thanks, Dan. I think, you know, I think that's absolutely right, and I hope it's been, well, I think it's maybe not been explicit enough then in what I was in what I was saying, because that's precisely the direction that I would like to go. That the Platonic dialogue, right, takes aspects of tragedy and transforms them. It takes aspects of comedy and transforms them into something entirely new. Right? A passage that we could bring in. It's not a Socratic passage, but remember the passage in the Laws where they're considering about the extent to which they're going to allow tragedy in the city, and the Athenian stranger conceives that what they will say to the tragedians is like, no, go and hawk your tragedies somewhere else, because we think that the polis, our well-governed polis, is the best tragedy. So Auguste Diès wrote this great book decades and decades ago now, called La Transposition Platonicienne. And I think one of the things that he suggested, and that I have always found very, very, very helpful, is to think that Plato takes cultural forms that exist at his time, he empties them out of the meaning that they have in their cultural context, and he fills them with a new meaning, which is, you know, which is philosophy. So yes, it is a triumph at the end of the Phaedo. We do refuse tragedy. There is something wrong with it. So thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, William Striegel.
Yes, hi, can you guys hear me? Yes, hey, Kathryn, good to see you. I don't know if you remember me. We met briefly at the Durham conference some years back. Yeah, and the comedy conference. Just really wonderful stuff. And I'm really pulled this way and that way, and I have many different questions, so I'll have to pick one if that's okay. Or rather, actually, so I wanted to, let's say, ask a question about your discussion of animal language in that one passage where you talk about there could be other possible, you know, Aristophanic and non-Aristophanic comic intertexts at play. But actually, I just wanted to sort of throw something onto the table and see what you make of it, because I've often thought that there's an intertext going on with the very end of, I think, Frogs, where, you know, Aristophanes says, don't go sitting around with Socrates, fritting away the day, forgetting the art of musicae, right? The greatest part of the art of tragedy. And yet on the final day of Socrates' life, in Plato's portrayal, of course, right, Socrates' friends are literally sitting around with him, setting out to determine whether death is something to be feared, right? You know, which is a tragic topos if ever there were one. And then, of course, you know, he'll cite the comic poets at 70C and so forth. But my question to you anyway is, if you can help me figure it out, because I don't know if I'll ever write about it or look into it deeply, but since you are really, you know, working on the comic intertextuality here with the Phaedo, what would you say? I mean, is it a coincidence that Socrates also problematizes the nature of musicae at the dialogue extensively, right, in the prologue of the dialogue, and so he's kind of, Plato is making a pseudo-Euripidean Aristophanic move, something very strange, something very atopos, in my own opinion. So, if you could just give me some thoughts, I'm happy to listen.
I can give you a thought. I think that's a great intertext. I like it a lot. I would not be at all surprised if it were in Plato's mind, although of course we can never know it, and I know that we're not meant to care about whether it was in his mind or not. But this actually takes me back to sort of transposition, right? That musicae is going to be one of the things that gets emptied out and then reconceived. So I think one of the things that's going on in the Phaedo is we start the dialogue by and Socrates says he's always had dreams all throughout his life, right? Make music and work at it, right? Ergazdu. And he said he had always thought that he was doing this by pursuing philosophy, but now it's almost as if there's like this brief crisis of confidence, right? Did the god actually mean, right, a hymn, a hymn to Apollo? Did he perhaps mean a Socratic fable? So he sort of like, as a kind of purification, a kind of literary purification, he starts to do some work on this. But then I think what we find out during the course of the Phaedo is that Socrates was right all along, and that these little forays into Aesopic fable and hymns to, and hymns to Apollo were misguided, because the real music is the music that's being made in the Phaedo on that last day. It's the music of the conversation. So then, right, the art of musicae is deconstructed and reconstructed in the image of philosophy, just as to a certain extent I think is going to happen in the Phaedrus, right? There are a lot of these themes coming up again in the Phaedrus, and the relationship to the muses there. So, right, so if you have published on this, I will footnote you when I finally write this up, and if not, I will still footnote you.
Well, thanks. You're welcome to have that. I just, it's something that's always puzzled me, and I realize I'd have to dig deep into comic perceptions of Socrates and Euripides, I think, in order to sort of get a full grasp on that. But yeah, you would think that my intuition was generally on the same lines, I think, right? Which is that the Phaedo is a Socratic tragedy in a way that Aristophanes ridicules, but probably without as much malice as some people might think. But maybe that's to get too far into the matter. But thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. We've got no hands raised at the moment. One or two people have raised their hands and put them down again. I invite you to reconsider and raise your hand. Otherwise, I think we're right about at the end of time. How are we? All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Kathryn, for giving such a wonderfully stimulating and rich talk. I clap and make noise on behalf of those who are muted. I hope to see as many of you as possible at this event again in 2 weeks.
Thank you all.